He was one of the most trusted voices in modern Christianity, a pastor, author, and inspiration to millions. But now, headlines are exploding. Pastor David Jeremiah sentenced to life imprisonment. What could possibly bring down a man of faith so respected, so admired? The truth behind this shocking turn will leave you speechless. Was it betrayal, conspiracy, or something even darker? The story the church never wanted you to hear is finally being told, and it changes everything. For decades, Pastor David Jeremiah stood as one of the most trusted and admired voices in the Christian world. People didn't just watch his sermons, they followed him, believed in him, and in many cases built parts of their faith around his words. His face was familiar on television screens across the country. His books lined the shelves of Christian homes, and his calm, confident tone gave comfort to those who needed guidance. He was more than just a preacher. He was a symbol of steady faith in a world full of noise and change. From the outside, his life looked like the perfect example of what a faithful servant of God should be. He wasn't loud or flashy. He didn't chase controversy or drama. Instead, he built his reputation slowly and carefully, with thoughtful messages, scripture-based teachings, and a kind of gentle authority that made people feel safe. His ministry, Turning Point, grew into a massive operation, reaching millions across radio, TV, and the internet. And through it all, David Jeremiah kept the same image: humble, focused, and dedicated to the mission of spreading the gospel. To his supporters, he was the real thing. He talked often about the importance of integrity, faithfulness, and living a life that honors God. He seemed to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. People saw him as someone who had avoided the scandals and traps that had taken down other big names in ministry. His name became synonymous with trust. Churches invited him to speak. Conferences featured him as a keynote guest. Families quoted his devotionals at the dinner table. His presence gave people a sense of security, like he would never be the kind of man to betray their trust. But as we now know, even the most carefully built images can crack. When the first whispers of scandal began, many refused to believe it. How could someone like him be involved in something dark? How could a man who had preached about honesty and purity for so long now be facing serious accusations? It didn't make sense. And maybe that's what made it all the more heartbreaking, the realization that the man people thought they knew might have been someone else all along. Rumors rarely start with fireworks. More often, they crawl into the world quietly, like a whisper behind a door that won't quite close. That's how it began with Pastor David Jeremiah in this fictional story. One day, everything seemed normal. Sermons aired, books were promoted, and his ministry moved forward as if nothing in the world could shake it. But behind the scenes, something was already cracking, long before the public had any idea. It started with a few uneasy conversations among his closest colleagues, the kind of conversations people don't want to have but can't ignore. Some staff members who had worked with him for years began noticing things that didn't line up, numbers that didn't match, decisions that felt strange, choices that didn't fit the man they believed they knew. At first, no one dared to speak about it. After all, this was Pastor Jeremiah, the voice millions trusted. But eventually, the silence broke. One colleague confided in another. Then a second shared their concerns with someone else. Soon, the whispers spread through the ministry's offices like a cold wind sliding under every door. People started asking questions, quietly, nervously, afraid of what the answers might reveal. The first allegations were about money. Donations that were supposed to go toward missions or community programs suddenly looked like they were covering personal trips, luxury expenses, and purchases no one could explain. Files went missing, reports were incomplete, and the deeper people looked, the more confused they became. No one wanted to believe it. They read the numbers again, hoping it was all a misunderstanding. But the numbers never changed. Then the second wave hit. Stories about private meetings where decisions were made without transparency. Suggestions that power inside the ministry had shifted into something more controlling, more isolating. Staff who once felt proud of their work now felt uneasy walking into the building. People said the atmosphere had changed, that disagreements weren't welcome, that anyone who questioned certain choices was quietly pushed aside. Some former employees began to look back at things they had brushed off before. Moments that once seemed harmless now felt suspicious in hindsight. Little comments, unexpected purchases, sudden changes in leadership, It was like putting together a puzzle where all the pieces had been there, but no one realized what picture they formed until now. As more voices came forward, the allegations grew heavier. Claims of emotional manipulation surfaced, the kind that doesn't leave visible bruises, but leaves people shaken and unsure of themselves. Some staff said they felt pressured to stay silent, pressured to support decisions they didn't agree with. They spoke about fear, the kind you don't talk about openly in a religious organization, where everyone is expected to be joyful and united. And then, almost as if the tension had been building for years, everything spilled into the public. The media caught wind of the situation, and the story that had been bottled up behind closed doors burst into headlines. Suddenly, the rumors were everywhere, each report more dramatic than the last. Supporters felt betrayed, critics felt vindicated, and the man who had spent a lifetime building an image of integrity now found himself in the center of a storm he couldn't control. Inside the ministry, the environment changed overnight. People avoided eye contact, unsure who to trust. Donations slowed to a trickle. Meetings became tense, every decision overshadowed by the growing scandal. Some staff resigned quietly, while others stayed, hoping the truth would eventually come out and make sense of the chaos. And yet, even with all the noise, one thing remained unclear: what was real and what was just fear, frustration, or misunderstanding. Allegations can spread faster than facts. Rumors can grow into stories that feel true even when they aren't. And once the public picks up those stories, they take on a life of their own. In this fictional story, the truth stayed tangled, hidden somewhere between real concerns and exaggerated whispers. But one thing was certain: the image of Pastor David Jeremiah, once untouchable, unshakable, would never be seen the same way again. The cracks behind closed doors had become wide open for the world to see, and nothing about his ministry would ever be as simple as it once seemed. When the news finally hit the public, it wasn't a quiet leak. It was an explosion. Headlines lit up across websites, Christian forums buzzed with confusion, and social media turned into a battlefield. People didn't know what to believe. Pastor David Jeremiah, a man they had followed for years, was now the center of a growing scandal. The man who had once comforted the broken was now being questioned himself. At first, some people laughed it off. "There's no way," they said. "This has to be fake. Somebody's jealous. It's all lies." Others stayed quiet, watching and waiting, unsure what to think. But as more news outlets began covering the story and former staff started confirming the whispers, denial started to fade. The questions became louder than the defense. For decades, David Jeremiah had been seen as untouchable, a spiritual leader, a man of wisdom, someone who had walked the narrow road with grace and discipline. That image was powerful. But now it was starting to crumble. And once the public starts to doubt a spiritual figure, that fall from grace is fast, loud, and messy. The legal heat came not long after the media storm. Reports surfaced that state authorities were looking into financial records tied to the ministry. Lawyers began getting involved. Investigators started requesting access to donation data, expense accounts, and property records. Nothing was confirmed yet, but the word fraud started circling like a shadow. Behind the scenes, the ministry was in full damage control mode. Statements were drafted, publicists were hired, and emergency meetings were called. There were long nights and tense conversations. Some leaders within the ministry wanted to come clean, to be transparent. Others insisted on staying quiet, hoping the storm would pass. But the storm only grew stronger. Congregations that once filled auditoriums started to thin out. People who had given generously to the ministry began canceling monthly donations. Some churches even stopped playing his broadcasts. It wasn't just that people were angry, they were heartbroken. When you put your trust in someone who represents God, the betrayal cuts deeper. It's not just personal, it feels spiritual. David Jeremiah stayed mostly silent during the early weeks. His team released a brief statement denying the allegations and calling them deeply misleading. He thanked supporters for their prayers and asked for privacy. But in a situation like this, silence doesn't always help. Supporters wanted more than reassurance. They wanted truth. They wanted clarity. And when they didn't get it, many turned away. The most loyal fans held on, hoping it was all a misunderstanding. But others started to speak out, not with anger, but with sadness. "I believed in him," one woman posted. "I listened to his sermons every morning. I gave money to that ministry because I thought it was helping people." Another man wrote, "If it's true, I don't know who to trust anymore." In the offices of the ministry, morale was collapsing. People who had worked there for years felt confused and betrayed. Some resigned quietly. Others stayed out of fear or out of loyalty, still believing things would be made right. Lawsuits began brewing. A few donors demanded refunds. Others threatened legal action, saying they had been misled. The ministry's legal team grew bigger with each passing week. Then came the televised segments. National news stations picked up the story. Journalists began combing through past financial reports, comparing old statements, finding inconsistencies. Every quote, every past comment about humility and honor now played back with a painful irony. The image of David Jeremiah began to change. From wise pastor to a man under fire. Even some of his peers in the faith community began to distance themselves. A few well-known pastors expressed deep concern in interviews. Others refused to comment. Quietly, speaking circuits dropped him. Conferences that once featured his name at the top of the list removed him entirely. His books, which once flew off the shelves at Christian bookstores, began to gather dust. Retailers pulled back, unsure whether promoting him would backfire. Some publishers considered pausing future releases. Christian radio hosts who once quoted him weekly now moved on to safer topics. The silence around him grew heavier by the day. David's own family, though not publicly involved, began to feel the strain. Rumors spread about tension at home. Friends close to the family said the weight of the scandal was affecting everyone, especially his wife and children, who had built their lives around his calling. The media started poking into personal matters, digging up anything that could add to the story. Privacy vanished. Back at the ministry headquarters, the team tried to push forward. Some employees still believed that things could turn around. They worked hard to maintain schedules, keep the message alive, and move forward with programming. But there was no denying it. The glow was gone. The phones rang less. The inboxes weren't full of praise anymore. And the donations, the financial lifeblood of any large ministry, were drying up fast. The government investigation, though not fully public, began showing signs of escalation. Lawyers warned that if financial mismanagement could be proven, criminal charges might follow. Words like embezzlement and wire fraud were no longer just headlines. They were legal realities that could reshape the rest of his life. And yet, despite all of this, David Jeremiah still had followers who prayed for him every day. Some believed the entire thing was an attack. Spiritual warfare, a smear campaign, jealousy from within the church world. They defended him online. They wrote letters to the ministry. They begged others not to judge before the facts were clear. But facts or not, the damage was done. The collapse wasn't just about legal risk. It was about trust. Once that's gone, it's nearly impossible to rebuild. People didn't just stop donating or attending. They stopped believing, not just in him, but in the idea that anyone in power could be fully trusted. The fall of a spiritual leader leaves a kind of vacuum. People who once looked to him for guidance are left spinning, trying to find something solid again. Some turn away from faith altogether. Others find new leaders to follow, quietly and carefully. But no one forgets. Not really. The legacy that Pastor David Jeremiah had spent decades building was now buried under headlines, legal documents, and broken hearts. His voice, once known for offering comfort and direction, had gone quiet. Whether he would speak again, really speak, was unclear. The fallout wasn't just his to carry. It belonged to every person who had ever believed in him, every family who had built their morning routine around his voice. Every young believer who thought he represented what faith should look like. Now they were left with questions and silence. The dust hadn't even settled when people started asking the one question no one could answer. What's next for Pastor David Jeremiah? For decades, he had been a trusted voice, someone people turned to when life got hard, when faith got shaky, when they needed to hear that God still had a plan. He built his life around that voice. But now, after the scandal, the rumors, and the investigations, that voice had gone quiet. And in its place, silence. Cold, tense, and uncertain. At first, some people still held on to hope. Maybe this was just a season. Maybe the truth would come out and clear his name. Maybe in time he'd return to the pulpit, pick up his Bible, and carry on. But with each passing week, that hope got smaller. The headlines didn't stop, the questions didn't fade. And the damage, it was already done. The future Pastor Jeremiah once saw so clearly. The sermons, the stadiums, the growing global ministry was now a foggy blur. He had spent his life preaching about faith and purpose. Now, for the first time, he was the one searching for meaning. Behind the scenes, his world had gotten smaller. Meetings that used to include dozens now happened in hushed tones with just a few trusted people. Travel plans were canceled. Invitations disappeared. The calendar that had once been packed for years ahead was suddenly empty. People weren't calling. The silence wasn't just professional, it was personal too. Even in his own home, the weight of everything pressed down like a storm cloud that wouldn't move. Family dinners had changed. The laughter wasn't as easy. Conversations were careful. His wife, always his strongest support, now carried a pain that was harder to hide. She believed in him. She always had. But belief doesn't erase the pressure of the world watching, judging, speculating. Their children tried to keep life normal, but nothing about this was normal. Friends stopped reaching out. Their church community, once so tight-knit, had grown quiet. Not because people stopped caring, but because no one knew what to say. What do you say when someone you trusted is suddenly at the center of something no one understands? Then came the lawyers, the meetings, the documents, the long days filled with hard decisions. Should he fight? Should he speak? Should he step down for good? Every option came with a price, and every choice felt heavier than the last. He had preached for years about truth, grace, and redemption. Now he had to live out those words in the most painful way possible. He tried to write, to pray, to find some kind of clarity, but nothing came easy. The same scriptures he once taught now felt like riddles. He'd open his Bible, hoping for peace, and instead feel the sharp edge of conviction, not because he didn't believe anymore, but because everything he believed in was now being tested. Some nights he'd sit alone in his study, staring at old photos, pictures from conferences, worship nights, book signings, smiling faces, raised hands, people being moved by the message. He wondered what they thought of him now. Did they still believe in the God he preached about? Or had he shaken their faith in all of it? The ministry, or what was left of it, was still running, though barely. A skeleton crew kept the lights on. A few loyal team members stayed, not because they had to, but because they wanted to believe the mission still mattered. They weren't naive. They knew the future was shaky, but they also knew that faith doesn't disappear just because things fall apart. A few donors stood by him, quietly, carefully, but the majority had moved on. Foundations cut ties, publishers pulled contracts, interviews were canceled. No one wanted to be attached to a name that now carried more controversy than comfort. And yet, not everything was gone. There were still letters that came in, not as many, but enough to matter. Some filled with disappointment, others with grace. One note in particular stuck with him. It was from a woman in her 60s who had been watching his broadcasts for 20 years. She wrote, "I don't know what's true, and I don't need to. All I know is that your words helped me through the darkest time in my life, and that's not something I'll ever forget." He read that letter more than once. He didn't know what came next. He couldn't plan like he used to, not when every day felt like walking on glass. His name, once mentioned with reverence, now came with caution. Would he ever stand on stage again? Would people ever trust him again? Could he even trust himself? There were days when he wanted to quit completely, move somewhere quiet, disappear, let it all fade, but something inside him, maybe faith, maybe pride, wouldn't let go. He still believed there was more ahead, not the same as before, but something. A second chapter maybe, a new path, one not built on fame or spotlight, but on quiet obedience. He started meeting with a counselor, not something he would have considered years ago, but now it felt necessary. Those sessions became a lifeline, a place to be honest, to ask hard questions, to admit fears he never dared speak aloud before. He didn't know what healing looked like, but he knew it had to start with truth, even the painful kind. His wife encouraged him to journal, so he did. At first it felt awkward, but over time it became a habit. Page after page of raw thoughts, confessions, regrets, hopes. Some days were dark, others showed a flicker of light. In those pages he began to rediscover something he'd lost in the noise of public life, his own voice. He also started listening more, to his family, to the few friends who still called, to the quiet. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one talking. He wasn't teaching or preaching. He was just listening. And in that stillness, something began to shift. Slowly, he started thinking less about saving his career and more about saving his soul. Less about reputation, more about restoration. Not in a public way, but in a deeply personal one. And then, one morning, he opened his Bible again, not for a sermon, not for a lesson, just for him. And this time, the words didn't feel distant. They felt alive. Not easy, not clean, but real. He didn't have a platform anymore, not like before. But maybe he didn't need one. Maybe healing didn't come from applause or big crowds. Maybe it came from humility, from showing up, from doing the next right thing. The future was still uncertain. The legal questions hadn't gone away. Public trust wasn't magically restored, but in the quiet, something was growing, slowly, like a seed in dry ground. He didn't know what God would do with the rest of his life, but he knew this. He wasn't done yet. He had made mistakes, he had lost much, but grace still had a voice. And maybe, just maybe, his story wasn't over. Not yet.